The state of Iowa is known as the corn capital of the world. But Iowa's 3 million residents do a lot more than produce billions of bushels of corn every year. They also personify some of the best qualities that America has to offer. Located in the Midwestern part of the country and surrounded by 2 rivers and 6 other states, the people of Iowa take pride in being friendly, considerate, law-abiding, hardworking, and just plain nice. The state is one of the safest in the country, and every year, national surveys show that Iowa residents are among the most polite Americans you will ever meet. And if there's one place in Iowa where you are guaranteed to be treated, quote, Iowa nice, it's the little town in the southwest corner of the state called Shenandoah. At one time, Shenandoah was considered the seed and nursery capital of the entire world. They no longer hold that title, but residents of this town are still surrounded by some of the most beautiful flowers and trees on the planet, along with some of the best tasting fruits and vegetables. And back in 1988, if there was one person in Shenandoah who absolutely embodied the town's spirit of friendliness, hospitality, and local pride, it was 39-year-old Cindy Borton. If you were a visitor to Shenandoah back in the late 1980s, Cindy would be one of the first people to run right up to you to introduce herself and offer you directions or recommendations of where to go in her little town. And if you were one of Cindy's friends or neighbors, she would drop anything she was doing to help you, and it didn't matter if it was day or night. Unlike many of the town's 5,500 residents whose family had been living in the town for generations, Cindy and her husband Robert and their son John had moved to Shenandoah later in life. Cindy was born on May 22, 1949, in another small Iowa town called Garwin that was located 3.5 hours to the northeast of Shenandoah. There, she and her brother had grown up playing outside and helping their parents with daily chores. After high school, Cindy went to work at a local restaurant, which is where she met her future husband, Robert. He had grown up in another Iowa town about 30 minutes away from her. Robert was a stocky young man with horn-rimmed glasses and brown hair that he swept back from his receding hairline, and when he met Cindy, he was instantly charmed by the smiling and laughing waitress with thick dark hair and shining eyes. A year after meeting, Cindy and Robert got married, and 1 year after that, they welcomed their first and only child, a baby boy named John. Early on in their marriage, Robert enlisted in the U.S. Navy, and so he was gone a lot of the time. As a result, Cindy stepped up and became the anchor of the family, always putting the needs of her husband and her son over her own. She also began working multiple part-time jobs to supplement Robert's military income, which was just not that much. However, she only took jobs that did not interfere with her ability to spend quality time with her son, John. In 1977, after Robert left the military, the Bortons moved to a town in Illinois called Evanston. There, Robert enrolled in a private seminary so that he could fulfill his lifelong dream of becoming an ordained pastor. In 1981, Robert graduated from the seminary, and a year later, he got an offer from a little church in Shenandoah asking him to come be their pastor. Robert and Cindy were thrilled, and so after Robert accepted the offer, the little family packed up their belongings and then made the 8-hour trip west back to their home state of Iowa and into the pretty little town of Shenandoah. Once in Shenandoah, Cindy immediately threw herself into her new role as the pastor's wife. She was naturally outgoing and empathetic, and so she pretty much instantly became a favorite, not just with Robert's congregation, but with the rest of the town as well. Even though Robert had landed his dream job, it was not a high-paying job, and so like Cindy, he needed to go out and pick up some extra work to make ends meet. Robert would get a part-time job at a car dealership where he washed and cleaned cars, and Cindy, after arriving in Shenandoah, worked as many as 3 part-time jobs, including her main one at a donut shop. But despite how much Cindy and Robert were forced to work every week, they were very happy people. In fact, when most people described Cindy when she was living in Shenandoah, they would talk about her laughter. Because 1, she seemed to always be laughing and smiling, and 2, because her laughter was incredibly infectious, and anyone who heard it couldn't help but laugh themselves. But the Bortons' seemingly perfect life would go off the rails in 1987, 5 years after the Bortons had arrived in Shenandoah. That summer, Robert's church, which had been struggling financially for years, was finally forced to shut their doors, and so Robert's job was gone, and so too was his main source of income. This loss was devastating both emotionally and financially for the Borton family. By September of the following year, 1988, Robert had not had any luck finding another pastor gig in town or nearby, and the income they were making between Robert's car dealership work and Cindy's various part-time jobs was just not enough, and so the couple began talking about relocating. However, they both loved Shenandoah, it was their home, and John, who was 18 at the time, he was about to start his senior year in high school, and so they really didn't want to pull him out until he was done. And so Cindy and Robert decided that they would just stay in Shenandoah and they would weather the financial storm they were in, and then maybe after John graduated from high school, they would think about moving. But when John's senior year actually began that September, the Bortons' 18-year-old son suddenly developed a serious case of senioritis, meaning he didn't want to go to school. And on the morning of Tuesday, September 6th, just a few days into the new school year, John walked into the family kitchen and announced to his mother that he did not want to go to school ever. Cindy had to argue with John all by herself because Robert had already left that morning for work. But luckily, John eventually just gave up because he knew his mother was not going to budge. She wanted him to go to school. And so begrudgingly, John ate his breakfast, he gathered up his backpack, and he followed his mother out to her car that was parked in the driveway. On the drive to school, Cindy reminded her son that she'd be working at the donut shop that afternoon, and so he'd have to walk home. When they arrived at Shenandoah High School a few minutes later, John, who was still very annoyed with his mother for forcing him to go to school that day, he got out and he slammed the car door before mumbling a barely audible goodbye to his mother. As Cindy drove the short distance back to their house, she tried to tell herself that, John's behavior was just typical teenage behavior, and once the school year really got going, John's attitude would surely improve. Still, it was something she intended to talk to Robert about when he came home that afternoon for his lunch break. Once Cindy was back at their home, she parked the car in the driveway and walked through the back door and down the short hallway into the kitchen. After cleaning up the breakfast dishes, she caught up on a few household chores and made sure that the clothes she planned to wear to work that afternoon were clean and ready to go. Then she glanced at her watch and headed back into the kitchen to heat up some spaghetti sauce and pasta for lunch with Robert. Right at 12 p.m. that afternoon, just a half mile away, Robert would tell his boss that he was headed home for his 1-hour-long lunch break. A few minutes later, Robert pulled his pickup truck into the driveway of his modest little house. He turned off the engine, and he walked up the steps to the front door. As he stepped into their small living room, he called out to let Cindy know that he was home. After she called back to him from the kitchen, Robert went to the first-floor bathroom to wash up before he too headed into the kitchen to join his wife. As Cindy served him a hot plate of spaghetti, Robert listened as Cindy told him about how John had not wanted to go to school that morning and how upset he was when she dropped him off. And Robert would agree with his wife that, this did seem like typical teenage behavior and that, probably as the school year wore on, his attitude would change. The pair would chat about John's behavior for the bulk of their meal, and then at about 12:45, Robert put his dishes in the sink, he thanked Cindy for his lunch, and then he told her he'd see her that afternoon after she got home from her shift at the donut shop. A few minutes after Robert had left the house to return to work, Cindy was already washing the lunch dishes when she heard a knock on the back door. She glanced at her watch and wondered who would be visiting her in the middle of the day. A little over an hour later, at around 2 p.m., Robert received a call at the car dealership where he worked. When his boss handed him the phone, Robert heard the voice of Cindy's coworker at the donut shop. Sue Rogers told him that Cindy had not shown up for work, which was unlike her since she usually arrived for her shift early. Sue had tried calling the Borton house, but no one had picked up. Robert told Sue that, maybe Cindy had taken a nap after lunch and she's just overslept. An hour later, at 3 p.m., Robert got another call from the donut shop. This time, Sue sounded worried. Cindy still had not shown up for work, and a coworker who went by the Borton house had stopped at the back door to call out for Cindy, but didn't get an answer. And they noticed that the door was open. But this coworker didn't want to go inside without being invited, and so they left. Robert called home, and when Cindy did not pick up the phone, he asked his boss if he could leave work to go check on his wife. Just after 3:30 p.m., Robert pulled up to his house, and the first thing he noticed was that Cindy's car was still in the driveway. After parking his truck just behind her car, Robert walked up to the front door and let himself in, calling out his wife's name as soon as he stepped inside. When there was no answer, Robert began walking from the living room where he came in at the front of the house toward the back of the house where the kitchen was. As he walked, he kept yelling out for Cindy, but it was silent. When Robert finally reached the kitchen and got a view of the kitchen, he came to a complete and sudden stop. Backing slowly away, Robert reached for a nearby phone on the wall and he called 911. When they picked up, he would tell police to come to his house right away because his wife had had a terrible accident. After hanging up the phone, Robert grabbed the family dog's collar off of a nearby hook, and he put it on the dog and led the dog outside to the backyard where he tied the dog up, and then Robert walked around the outside of the house to the driveway in front, where he leaned against the side of Cindy's car, and there he waited patiently for the police to arrive. When the local police and ambulance arrived at the Borton house a few minutes later, Robert stepped forward to meet them. Then he stayed outside while the police and the medical technicians entered the front door and made their way into the kitchen and back. What they saw inside was so shocking and so gruesome that the chief of police, Richard Hunt, he knew this was not a crime or a crime scene that his local police force could handle. He needed serious help from the state, and he needed that help right away. The kitchen was covered in blood, and lying on her back in the middle of the floor was Cindy Borton. She had been stabbed 29 times with various bloody weapons that were found near her body on the ground. Based on the sheer violence of the attack and the fact that the back door had been unlocked and undamaged, Chief Hunt was sure that this crime had been personal. He knew the crime statistics in Iowa. 85% of all homicides in the state were committed by people and family members who were close to the victim, which meant that right away, Cindy's husband, Robert, and her son, John, were at the top of the list of potential suspects. And so as Chief Hunt and the rest of the local police force more or less waited for the state law enforcement to arrive so they could actually begin processing the scene, Chief Hunt decided to just go outside and speak with Robert. And so he went outside, he walked down the front steps, and he made his way over to Robert, who was still near Cindy's car, and Chief Hunt would ask him, "Robert, do you have any idea who could have done this to your wife?" After Robert said, no, he didn't, the police chief was shocked when Cindy's husband went on to insist that his wife's death must have been an accident. But before the chief could continue questioning Robert, they were interrupted by the arrival of the Borton family's son, John, who was walking down the road towards the family house on his way home from school. John slowed down as he approached the house and took in the sight of the police cars and an ambulance parked along the curb and the yellow crime scene tape along the perimeter of their yard. When John reached his father, Robert told him that something bad had happened to his mother and that she was dead. But as Robert reached out to put his hands on his son's shoulders, John dropped his backpack and just turned around and started running. Later, he would tell law enforcement that the news was so shocking he just couldn't handle it, and so that's why he ran. When John did return to his house almost 2 hours later, personnel from the state's Division of Criminal Investigation had finally arrived, and they were dusting for fingerprints and gathering evidence inside of the Borton house. And local law enforcement had fanned out around the neighborhood to ask the Borton's neighbors if they had seen anything unusual or suspicious that day. By then, Robert had also told police exactly what he had done that day, starting with him leaving the house at 6:45 a.m. to go to work, and then arriving at work at 7 a.m., and then coming home again at noon for lunch with Cindy, and then leaving again and getting back to the car dealership at 1 p.m. Robert also described the calls he got from the donut shop saying that Cindy had not shown up for her 2 p.m. shift, and he would describe to police what it was like when he arrived at his house at 3:30 p.m. to check to see if Cindy was okay. After John was back at the house, he would tell police that he had been at school from the time his mother had dropped him off in the morning until school let out at 3:30, and then he had walked home. When the state investigators asked John if anything about that morning had seemed out of the ordinary, at first John said no, but then after a few seconds, he changed his answer to yes. He said that he and his mother had been arguing that morning because John didn't want to go to school that day, but he told police this was not anything serious. By the time John and Robert left the Borton property to go stay that night with friends that they knew from Robert's old church, word had spread throughout Shenandoah that something unspeakable had happened to one of the town's most popular residents. Early the next morning on September 7th, there were police officers waiting at Robert's car dealership to check on Robert's alibi. And while Robert's timesheet confirmed the timeline Robert had given them, Robert's boss added one detail about that day that Robert had left out. When Robert arrived back at the dealership after his lunch break, he had apparently changed his clothes. When asked if that was unusual, his boss would say, "Not really." Robert's boss would say that on Tuesdays, the car dealership's commercial cleaning service would come by to pick up dirty uniforms and rags, and so Robert's boss thought that, maybe Robert had come to work that day in his work clothes, he had gotten a full morning of work in, and then when he went home for lunch, he had changed, and then when he had come back, maybe he had dropped off those dirty clothes from the morning with the cleaning service. While this seemed totally plausible, investigators couldn't help but think that if Robert was involved in the murder of his wife, and if there was any evidence from the murder on those work clothes, well, that evidence was now being destroyed by a commercial washing machine. Meanwhile, investigators who had arrived at Shenandoah High School early that morning to check John's alibi also had some questions. It would turn out John's alibi was not as straightforward as he had made it seem. His teachers at his high school told police that yes, John had come to school the previous day, but he did not have any classes between 1 and 3 p.m., and no one could really verify his whereabouts at that time, and it just so happens that that was likely the time frame when his mother was killed. And later that afternoon, a neighbor would tell police that they had seen a teenager running through the Bortons' backyard around the time that Cindy would have been killed. The neighbor couldn't give police much of a description of this teenager, except to say that the teenager was a boy and that he had a thin build and it looked like his hair was brown, which was basically a perfect description of John. And so, 2 days after Cindy's death, detectives brought John into the police station for questioning. When pressed about the 1 to 3 p.m. gap in his alibi, John would adamantly state that he never left school grounds during that time period. He said he had been at school all day from the time his mother dropped him off until he walked home and discovered the police and ambulances in front of his house. When asked about his parents' relationship, John admitted that there was some tension there and that sometimes he heard his parents arguing, mostly about money. But John also told police that his mother and father were very committed to each other and had been quite happy in the past. And so no matter what problems they might be having, John was confident that his parents were not even close to getting divorced. He believed they would look to find a solution that kept them together. As for his own relationship with his mother, John told police that his mother had been everything to him and that it totally crushed him that his last interaction with her was that stupid fight about him not wanting to go to school. Despite Robert and John continuing to deny that they had anything to do with the murder, 48 hours into the investigation, the father and son were still the prime suspects. 3 days after Cindy's murder, on September 9th, the results of her autopsy came back. Based on the fact that the spaghetti she had eaten for lunch on the day of her murder was completely undigested, police were able to narrow the time of her death down to about 1 p.m. Meanwhile, investigators questioning teachers and students at Shenandoah High School were starting to believe that John had been telling the truth, that he really had been on school grounds on the day of the murder from 1 to 3 p.m. At Cindy's memorial service on September 13th, 6 days after her murder, investigators were waiting outside the church. Before scratching John off of their suspect list, they wanted to talk with John's best friend, Jim Bettis, to see if he could offer any additional insights into John's relationship with his mother. Jim had been a frequent visitor at the Borton household, and since Cindy's death, he had been spending a lot of time with John, comforting him. And so police were hopeful that if John was involved, maybe Jim would have picked up on it, and maybe Jim would be willing to talk about it. But according to Jim, there really were no problems between John and his mother. He said John loved his mother and that he would never hurt her. And as for that fight that they got in over John going to school or not that morning, Jim said that was totally insignificant and not a reflection of John and Cindy's actual relationship. After speaking with Jim and a few other friends of John's that came out of the memorial service, investigators felt satisfied that John really was not involved, and so they crossed his name off the suspect list. So with no other new leads and no further information on any teenager running across the Bortons' yard on the afternoon of the murder, investigators were now sure that the killer had to be Cindy's husband, Robert. So, about 1 week after the murder, investigators brought Robert into the interrogation room in the basement of the local police station, and then once he was sitting down, a special agent from the state's Division of Criminal Investigation leaned in close to Robert and said, "Bob, let's quit playing games. We both know Cindy was dead when you went back to work." But for the next 3 hours, Robert, who showed very little emotion and no signs of grief, refused to change his story. He said he had nothing to do with his wife's murder. He said that Cindy had seemed totally normal when he left for work early on the morning of the day she died, and when he came home for lunch that day at noon, she was alive. And she was also still alive when he left to go back to work at 12:45 p.m. Before leaving the police station, Robert agreed to have his fingerprints collected, and he agreed to take a lie detector test. So, the very next day, a special agent drove Robert 150 miles northeast to Des Moines, where Robert was hooked up to a polygraph machine that would measure his physical reactions to a series of key questions. Questions like, "Did you hurt your wife?" or "Did you kill your wife?" And Robert would answer these questions the same way he had the day before in the basement interrogation room at the police station. "No, I didn't hurt my wife. No, I didn't kill my wife." But this time, the polygraph machine showed that Robert was not being truthful. He didn't fail his test by much, but the results convinced investigators that despite Robert's denials, he must be the killer. And so the agent who had administered the lie detector test pulled Robert aside for another round of intense questioning, telling him, "Hey, you failed this test, so you gotta tell us the truth now." But Robert continued to say that he had nothing to do with it, and he even fell asleep during this interrogation. Even with this failed lie detector test, the police lacked hard evidence that linked Robert to the murder. And so even though they wanted to keep him, they couldn't. They had to let him go. And so a special agent drove Robert back to Shenandoah, and on the drive, he turned to Robert and he said, "You know, Bob, when this is all over and you've been arrested, charged, tried, and convicted, I would be honored if you confessed to me." But a week later, 2.5 weeks after Cindy's murder, investigators got another piece of bad news when the state's crime lab reported that they had not been able to lift any fingerprints from the various murder weapons that had been found in Cindy's kitchen. They also were unable to pull any prints off of any other physical evidence that had been sent off for testing. As September inched towards October, and police had still not made any arrests, the residents of Shenandoah were outraged and scared. Every day they called the police station and the mayor's office seeking updates, and local gun stores reported a serious uptick in sales. And in November, Robert, who was being questioned by police nearly every day, and was being shunned by residents who now walked across the street to avoid talking with him, he packed up the family's belongings and moved with John to the town of Gladbrook, just outside of Des Moines, where he and Cindy had actually gotten married. Around this time, local reporters began asking the question that was on everyone's mind. How was it possible that in a town as small as Shenandoah, police could not figure out who had committed such a heinous crime? And on top of having a murderer on the loose, Shenandoah also had an arsonist on the loose. Around the time Cindy was killed, someone had been intentionally setting fires around town, damaging an elementary school, as well as destroying a pickup truck. And while the arson attacks didn't appear to be connected to Cindy's murder, it did seem odd that there would be two violent crimes happening at the same time in a town that saw almost zero violent crime. And so some investigators began to suspect, just because of the rarity of violent crime, that the arson attacks and the murder had to be connected. And on November 30th of that year, their suspicions seemed to be confirmed. On that day, there was an arson attack at Shenandoah City Hall, except this time, the arsonist left behind a note. On this note, the arsonist warned police that the school fire and the truck fire and the murder of Cindy Borton were nothing compared to what was coming next. At the end of this note, the arsonist identified themselves as, quote, the Night Stalker. The Night Stalker was the name of a notorious murderer in California who had been captured 3 years earlier. But what really caught the attention of law enforcement was the fact that whoever had signed the note also left behind a fingerprint at the very bottom of the piece of paper the note was written on. While investigators waited on the results of the fingerprint analysis, they returned to the scenes of the earlier arson attacks, and on a bridge near the school fire, police had found the letters NS painted on a concrete support. They believed these had to be the initials of the Night Stalker. By early December, the mayor of Shenandoah had received more than 200 calls from terrified residents demanding that the police find the arsonist/killer before they murdered anyone else. But the Night Stalker lead came to an abrupt end a few weeks later when the fingerprint analysis not only failed to match Richard Borton's fingerprints, it didn't match any prints on file in any local, state, or federal law enforcement database. So unfortunately, both the arson cases and the murder case began to grow cold. It wasn't until 5 months after Cindy Borton's murder that local and state investigators would get the tip they needed to break the murder and arson cases wide open. Around dinner time on the cloudy, cool night of January 30th, 1989, the Shenandoah police chief, Richard Hunt, got a call from one of his officers. There was a teenager who had just walked into the police station, and he wanted to talk with someone about the murder of Cindy Borton. A few minutes later, Chief Hunt was sitting in his office looking across his desk at 18-year-old Jack Johnson, one of John Borton's best friends and classmates, and one of the boys investigators had talked with back in September when they were confirming John's alibi for the time of his mother's murder. Jack told Chief Hunt that a few days earlier, on January 26th, Jack had been talking to someone, and during their conversation, Jack had asked this person what was the worst thing they had ever done. And this person paused for a moment, and then they said to Jack, "I've done something that I'm pretty sure God will never forgive me for." Jack would go on to tell police all the awful details of what this person claimed to have done that God would not forgive them for. Based on Jack's testimony, this is a reconstruction of what really happened to Cindy Borton. Back on the day that Cindy died, September 6th, 1988, she and her husband Robert were sitting in the kitchen eating spaghetti and talking about their son's recent bad behavior. After Robert was done eating, he put his dirty dishes in the sink, he thanked his wife for the food, and then he headed out the door to go back to work. As Cindy began washing the dishes, she heard a knock on the back door. Glancing at her watch, she saw it was already almost 1 p.m., which meant she didn't really have a lot of time to visit with whoever this was before she had to step away and get ready for her 2 p.m. shift at the donut shop. And so feeling a little bit flustered, Cindy turned off the faucet and she dried her hands, and then she walked around the counter and she walked down the very short hallway that led to the back door of the house. And as she walked down this hallway, she looked through the glass of the back door and she saw who her visitor was. And even though she was pressed for time, she couldn't help herself. She smiled. She was happy to see him. However, she was a little bit concerned that her visitor was not in school. But she opened the door, and as soon as the door was open, her visitor immediately reassured her that he understood he was supposed to be in school and he'd be there soon. He was just stopping by because he was hoping that Cindy wouldn't mind being a reference for a job that he was going to be applying for. And so Cindy said, "Yeah, of course I'll be a reference for your new job. I'd love to hear about your new job. Come inside, let's talk about it." And so her visitor stepped inside, and as they walked down the little hallway towards the kitchen, the visitor asked Cindy if it was okay if she got him a glass of water because he was really thirsty. And so Cindy said, "Yeah, no problem. Come in the kitchen, I'll get you water, and we can talk about this new job." And so they start walking down this hallway, and the visitor reaches into his pocket and he unfolds his pocket knife. And right as Cindy is stepping into the kitchen with her back to him, he walks up behind her, he reaches around the front of her neck, and he digs the blade into the front of her throat, cutting her neck wide open. Cindy instinctively reached up and tried to grab her neck to protect herself, but her attacker grabbed her hands, pulled them away, and then with the knife, he dug another trench across her throat. And then the attacker backed up a couple of steps. Cindy, who was now pouring blood out of her neck, stumbled forward into the kitchen, and then she whipped around, clutching her throat, looking at her attacker. It was 18-year-old Jim Bettis, her son's best friend. But she didn't have time to process who was attacking her, because before long, as she was staring at him, he lunged at her again, slashing and cutting her. And so she put her hands up over her face to protect herself, and he was digging the knife over and over again into her forearms and her hands and all over her body. And eventually she kind of slumped onto the kitchen counter after being stabbed and cut so many times, at which point Jim walked away from her and he walked over to a drawer that he knew from all of the visits he had made to this household to visit with John. He knew that in this drawer were kitchen knives and other utensils. And so as Cindy is laying right near him up against the counter, pleading with him to stop, and she's bleeding everywhere, he reaches into this drawer and he pulls out 2 of Cindy's sharpest knives and he sets them on the counter, and then he pulls out 2 long serving forks that each had very pointed prongs at the end. And so he turns around to look at Cindy, and Cindy sees what he's doing, and so she tries to make a run for the phone to call 911. But before she could get there, Jim grabbed the 2 knives that he had just taken out of the drawer, and he leapt in front of Cindy and began stabbing her over and over and over again on her sides, her front, her face, her hands, her legs, anywhere he could, he would stab her. And Cindy the whole time is trying to hit him and push him back, but there's nothing she can do. She's helpless. And then at some point she kind of falls to the ground, but she's not dead yet. And so at that point, Jim put down the 2 knives he had just taken out of that drawer, and he went back and he got the 2 serving forks. And then he went back over to Cindy, who was now crawling across the ground trying to get to the phone, and he began stabbing her in the back of the neck, on the side, over and over and over again. Despite multiple puncture wounds to her vital organs, Cindy was not dying. She was bleeding profusely. She was likely mortally wounded at this point, but she kept trying to move forward. She kept trying to fight back. She was doing anything she could to save herself. But eventually, Jim overpowered her. He flipped her over onto her back. And then kneeling next to her, he got his tools lined up next to him, the 2 knives, his own knife, and the 2 serving forks. And systematically, he began using these tools to begin cutting and slashing and digging into the front of her torso. And he would continue to do that until Cindy finally stopped moving. And when she did stop moving, he picked up 1 of the serving forks, he raised it up over his head, and then he brought it straight down into her neck, plunging it deep inside of her. And then he let go of the handle, leaving the fork stuck into her neck. Then he wiped off the handle of that fork, as well as the other handles of the other murder weapons, which he just left on the floor next to Cindy. With the exception of his folding knife, he would take that. Then Jim stood up and walked into the small bathroom near the kitchen, and he washed his hands and face, leaving faint traces of blood in the sink, but wiping his fingerprints from the faucet handles. Then Jim retraced his steps to the back door. He stepped outside, and he paused for just a minute before taking off at a run across the Bortons' yard. He would be seen by that neighbor, except the neighbor would only be able to describe him as a thin teenager with brown hair. 3 hours later, Jim and his parents would be out driving around when they passed John, who had just bolted from the scene and the news of his mother's death. Jim's parents slowed the car down, and Jim leaned out the window and he comforted his friend, asking him if he wanted to come into the car and talk about what happened. Did he need a ride anywhere? But John, who was in a state of shock, would just shake his head and keep on running. 5 months after killing his best friend's mother, Jim would confess his crime to his other best friend, Jack Johnson. Not only would Jim tell Jack exactly where he had disposed of his pocket knife, he would also draw a diagram for Jack showing him exactly where Jim had left Cindy's body inside the Bortons' kitchen. On the night of January 30th, which was the day that Jack Johnson had gone to police to tell them about Jim, he presented Jim's hand-drawn diagram and pushed it across the desk to Chief Hunt. On February 2nd, 1989, police asked Jim Bettis to come to the police station for an interview. Once inside the interrogation room, Jim denied everything, saying he had never had that conversation with Jack Johnson. But after agreeing to let police collect his fingerprints, police determined Jim's prints matched the one found on the note left by the Night Stalker. After another round of questioning, Jim eventually admitted to being the arsonist, but it wasn't until he conclusively and massively failed his polygraph test that he would admit to police that, yes, he had killed Cindy Borden. It would turn out Jim had nothing against Cindy. The person he really hated was his own father. According to Jim, his father had spent years deriding and criticizing him. For a while, Jim had taken out his anger by setting fires around town, but for the last several months, he'd come to despise his father so much that all Jim could think about was killing him. But Jim was afraid of his father and couldn't really imagine himself besting his father in any kind of physical confrontation. And Jim wasn't even sure he could go through with killing anyone. So he decided what he needed to do was practice. He needed to find someone who would be easy to kill, someone vulnerable, someone who trusted him, someone who loved him. And the one person who fit that bill was his best friend's mother, Cindy Borden. As far back as Jim could remember, Cindy had been the one person he knew who was always glad to see him and who always had time to talk with him and who always offered him encouragement. She would be the last person to suspect that he could ever hurt her. And so he told himself if he could kill Cindy, maybe he could also kill his father. The police were able to finally prove their case against Jim when they found his pocket knife that he had tossed under a local bridge. The knife still had Cindy's blood on it, along with Jim's fingerprints. On November 13th, 1989, Jim Bettis, who was 19 years old at the time, was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. In a letter Jim wrote from prison, he told a relative that when he, quote, killed that lady, I guess I went too far and pretended that she was my dad. By 1990, 2 years after Cindy's murder, Robert and John had moved again, this time to Eldora, Iowa, a town of 3,000 residents located about 3.5 hours northeast of Shenandoah. Robert would remarry, and he would find work at a plastics recycling plant. State and local law enforcement in Shenandoah defended the intensive investigation techniques they used with Robert, saying that from the start, he was their only viable suspect. Now, 52 years old, Cindy's son John wants people to remember his mother for her life, not her death. He would tell reporters in April of 2022 that she was a wonderful, wonderful person, and I only miss her on days that end in the letter Y. Evening of April 15th, 2023, a mother and father named Hansa and Himu Makwana stood on the front doorstep of a little shack in a little village in western India called Vinchia. With these two parents were their two kids, a son and a daughter, who were 12 and 13 years old respectively, and they were really excited because tonight they were going to be spending the night with their uncle and their cousins who lived in this shack right in front of them. And so moments later, the door to this shack opened up and immediately the two kids ran inside calling out for their cousins, and the uncle who had opened the door, he just smiled and said hello to Himu and Hansa, and the parents, they're calling after their kids to, please behave, listen to your uncle, be good, but they were already gone. And so finally the uncle said, don't worry, they're fine, we'll have a great night, we'll see you tomorrow. And so Himu and Hansa thanked him very much, and then they turned around, they grabbed each other's hands, and began walking out towards the dirt road that would take them back to their own home. The village that Himu and Hansa and their kids and their uncle and their cousins all lived in was a very poor, rundown farming community where for the most part people worked really hard but barely got by. But this night, as Himu and Hansa walked along this dirt road, passing by the shacks and tiny apartments and fields and livestock that were kind of all over the place, they weren't thinking about, the struggles of daily life in this village. Instead, they were thinking about how beautiful the village was that night. The sun was starting to set, and so the sky was this beautiful orange, and all the cows that had been out that day kind of wandering around the village were all starting to stand up and make their way back towards their stables for dinner, and with every step the cows made, the little bells on their neck would ring out. And so the scene in front of Himu and Hansa was so beautiful and peaceful that for a moment they just stopped on the road and kind of took in the sights and sounds. And then at some point, a group of cows who were making their way to their stable came up onto the road right where Himu and Hansa were, and very quickly the couple stepped back to make sure no mud or dirt got kicked up on their clothes. Now, Himu and Hansa were farmers by trade, and so on most days they would wear clothes that were covered in mud and dirt. But this night was different. Himu and Hansa were wearing their finest outfits, and they were not about to get them dirty. Hansa had on her beautiful red dress, and Himu was wearing a starched white button-up shirt. After the cows had crossed the road and suddenly the path was clear again for Himu and Hansa to walk on, Himu paused before taking a step, and he turned and just looked at Hansa. And Hansa, who lately had been feeling quite down, appeared to be very happy and radiant. And so Himu just smiled at Hansa, and at some point Hansa looked up and smiled at him, and then before long they were holding hands again, strolling down the road. A little while later, the couple turned onto their street, and just up ahead on the left side, just off the road, they could see their home, which was a small concrete and brick structure. But when the couple actually reached their property, instead of going in the front door, they walked around their property into the back side where all their crops were. They were growing peanuts and cotton. And Himu and Hansa just walked straight back away from their house through these fields all the way to the very back of their property, which was marked by this huge stone wall that was as tall as Hansa was. And when they reached this wall, they also reached their tent. It was like this patchwork tent they had built with one side being supported by the stone wall, and the other side, the side closest to them as they approached it, was supported by these pikes they had driven into the ground. Inside of this tent was the family's shrine to the Hindu god Shiva. And over the last couple of days, Himu and Hansa had been working on this new addition to the family shrine. It had been a lot of work, but it was finally done, and tonight, Himu and Hansa were finally going to be able to use it. The couple stood outside the tent, taking in the sights and sounds of the beautiful sunset, and then, one after the other, they went inside the tent. The next day, sometime in the afternoon, Himu and Hansa's children returned from their uncle's house after sleeping over there the night before. And when they got to their home, they went in the front door and immediately called out for their parents. But their parents were not inside the house. And so the siblings walked all around the house and then went out the back door thinking maybe their parents were out in the fields working. But when they went outside, they saw their parents were not out there either. And so as the kids stood there kind of wondering where their parents were, the boy said to his older sister, maybe they're in the shrine. So the kids left the back of their house, they cut straight across the field all the way to that back stone wall where they found the shrine, the tent that was propped up against the wall. And right away, the kids noticed something was off about the shrine. Whenever their parents were in there praying, they could typically hear them from a distance as they walked up to the shrine. But now, standing right outside of it, it was totally silent. The kids finally lifted up the flap of the tent, and they looked inside, and once again, they did not see their parents. Instead, what they saw inside of the shrine was totally confusing. The shrine, which their parents typically kept absolutely immaculately clean at all times, looked kind of dirty. There was this weird, rusty-colored liquid kind of all over everything, including on some of the holy objects, like the picture and statue of Shiva. And in the middle of the shrine, where there was this fire pit, were these two hunks of meat that looked like they had been placed in the fire and then forgotten about. The kids knew their parents would never leave the shrine in this condition, nor would they spoil food and let it sit out on a fire and not eat it. And so they're thinking to themselves, what happened inside of the shrine and where are my parents? And then when they did one more look around the inside of the shrine, they noticed something that they had not when they first opened up the tent. And when they realized what it was, they screamed and took off running. This is the story behind what those children saw. The night before, when their parents, Himu and Hansa, stepped inside the tent, they looked around and surveyed the shrine. Right in the middle of the shrine on the ground was that fire pit, and then off to the right side of the fire pit was a small egg-shaped statue that was a statue of Shiva, and then next to the statue was a picture of Shiva. Shiva is a powerful figure in the Hindu religion. He is viewed as a god of both rebirth and of destruction. And when he is portrayed, like in the photo and in the statue that was inside of the shrine, his skin is smeared white with the ashes of corpses. He has crescent moons in his hair, and around his neck are snakes and skulls. And so Shiva is kind of viewed as both a loving, kind god and also one to be scared of. And so after the couple looked around at their shrine for a second, they got to work. Even though that night it was very hot and muggy outside, the first thing the couple did was get some firewood off to the side inside of this tent, put it in the fire pit, and start a fire. And then after the fire was built, Hansa began sprinkling orange flower petals all around the statue and picture of Shiva. And at the same time, Himu got out a piece of paper and began writing a note. And as he wrote, his hand shook with nervous anticipation of what they were going to do that night. And then after Himu finished writing this letter, he and Hansa dipped their thumbs in ink and pressed them to the bottom of this note, kind of like signing the note. And then after the note was complete, they folded it up and tucked it between the statue and the picture of Shiva. Then Himu and Hansa turned their attention to their newest addition to the shrine. The new addition basically just looked like a big door frame, but without a door in the middle of it. It was made out of scrap metal that Himu and Hansa had gathered around their village, and if you were standing in front of this structure, it would almost look like you were looking at a doorway into the fire pit. And also draped over the top of this rectangular frame was a white rope. And so Himu and Hansa moved over right in front of the structure as if they were going to walk through the frame into the fire. But instead of doing that, they knelt down right at the base of the structure, right in the dirt, and then they both, in unison, began to say a prayer out loud. And then after the prayer was done, Himu reached up and grabbed one end of this white rope, and he began pulling it until it was tight. And then he pulled it a little bit more and a little bit more until he had it right where he wanted it, and then he held the rope steady. And then Himu, still holding onto this rope, along with Hansa, very carefully got down onto their bellies, Himu being very cautious not to give any slack to the rope or pull it any farther. And then once they were in position on their bellies, all they would have heard was the crackling of the fire in front of them, and all they would have felt was their hearts beating in their chest. Now, very likely, Himu and Hansa were terrified at this point. But this was their moment. They had come too far, and they knew they had to finish this ritual. And so, with one last loving look at each other, the couple nodded, and then turned their attention back to the fire, and then Himu let go of the rope. The rusty-colored liquid that Himu and Hansa's children would discover inside of this shrine the next day was Himu and Hansa's blood. And the two hunks of meat that their children saw in the fire pit were their parents' decapitated heads. The children realized this was the case when they scanned around the tent one more time and noticed their parents' headless bodies lying side by side at the base of the structure. That was what, of course, caused the children to run outside and go find the police. This new addition to the shrine, the metallic structure, was a homemade guillotine. A guillotine is a device that kills people by cutting off their heads. The white rope that Himu had pulled on was connected on one side to a very heavy metal blade. And so when he was pulling the rope, he was pulling that blade up off the ground until it was positioned right above them, and then he held it steady. And then when he let go, the blade fell straight down, striking the backs of their necks, decapitating them instantly and sending their heads rolling forward into the fire, as designed. When the police arrived at the shrine, they would find that letter that Himu and Hansa had written and then signed with their thumb, tucked near the statue and the picture. And in this note, Himu and Hansa would not give a reason for why they did this, but they would say, "This was our choice, we wanted to do this, we just ask that our living family members take care of our children and our elderly parents." No one has been able to give a reason for why Himu and Hansa intentionally decapitated themselves and then let their heads burn in a fire. Their family has said there was no indication that the couple was going to commit suicide. I mean, they seemed happy, they were not financially well off, but they were not financially struggling either. It seemed like their life was good. And so basically, this whole thing came out of left field. As for the police, they believe that Himu and Hansa must have been performing some sort of black magic ritual where they believed if they lopped their heads off and allowed them to roll forward and burn in this fire, that somehow would bring them closer to perhaps Shiva or some other god or some other higher power. But as of today, no one knows. Our next and final story is called The Metamorphosis. Buddhists believe that human life is a constant cycle of birth, suffering, and then death. And then you're reborn, you suffer again, you die again, over and over and over again, forever, unless you're able to achieve enlightenment, or nirvana as it's called. However, no one really knows what nirvana actually is, what it looks like, what it feels like, where it is. Buddhists will say that the only way to actually understand nirvana is to experience it yourself. It's kind of like trying to describe to someone what chocolate tastes like. You can use any number of superlatives to describe the flavor, but until that person bites a piece of chocolate, they won't really fully understand it. And so, the goal of all Buddhists is to try to attain nirvana. And every day, hundreds of millions of Buddhists all around the world try very hard to do just that. But within Buddhism, there is a small subset of practitioners who have effectively dedicated their entire existence to attaining nirvana. And these people are the famous Buddhist monks. It is extremely difficult to become a Buddhist monk because the sacrifice is enormous. You have to leave your family, your friends, society, all your possessions, your name, your status, everything, and go live in a monastery, which is a kind of isolated place where monks live. And there you will spend your life living this very simple, very strict religious life where basically all you do is try to attain nirvana. As a result of this extreme lifestyle that Buddhist monks live, they have developed a reputation for being some of the most disciplined people on the planet. But even by Buddhist monk standards, their sacred ritual of Sokushinbutsu takes discipline to a whole nother level. Sokushinbutsu was created over 1,000 years ago up in the rugged mountains of northern Japan by a sect of Buddhists called the Shingon. And the Shingon believed that you could attain nirvana through physical punishment. And out of that idea was born the incredibly brutal Sokushinbutsu ritual. In short, Buddhist monks can choose to participate in this ritual, and if they successfully complete it, they might attain nirvana. But they won't know until the ritual is over. Meaning it's kind of like a big gamble. Put yourself through absolute hell, and maybe you have this huge payoff, but maybe not. However, trying to attain nirvana through other means was really difficult. There was no other really clear pathways to nirvana, and so having this one distinct pathway, no matter how difficult it was really appealing. And so since its creation, hundreds and hundreds of Buddhist monks have tried it. And maybe less than 100 have actually successfully completed it. And then of that 100 or less, only 24 have actually attained nirvana. through this process. The instructions for Sokushin Butsu are actually quite simple. There are 3 phases. Phase 1 is called Moku Jikagayo, which roughly means tree-eating training, and it's primarily focused on the monk's diet. It takes 1,000 days to complete this phase. However, most monks go much longer than 1,000 days. During this phase, monks will only eat byproducts of trees. Things like seeds, nuts, tree bark, tree roots, pine needles, and they will collect all this food on their own. It should be noted, though, that some monks in this first phase will ingest small rocks. This is likely done because they are starving and they can't find food, and by eating the rocks take up space in their stomach and kind of curb their appetite a little bit, but because they don't actually digest the rocks, they're not technically breaking the phase 1 diet restrictions, and so they can continue on with this ritual. Additionally, during this first phase, the monks adhere to a very involved and strenuous physical exercise routine, and then whenever they're not foraging for food or exercising, they are meditating. At the end of the 1,000th day of phase 1, if the monk has survived, because sometimes phase 1 monks do die mostly from starvation, it is up to them if they are ready to move on to phase 2. This decision ultimately comes down to whether or not, 1, the monk actually adhered to the strict rules of phase 1, something really only that monk would know, and then 2, whether or not the monk actually believes they are spiritually ready to move on to phase 2. Phase 2 is much shorter than phase 1, but it is significantly more challenging. And so the monks going into phase 2, they really need to kind of bring their A game and have no second thoughts. They need to be fully committed to phase 2 in order to successfully complete it. For reference, most of the 24 monks who successfully attained nirvana through this ritual repeated phase 1, 2, or even 3 times just to make sure they really were ready. Phase 2 is called Nyojo, and it roughly translates to deep meditation. But a better way to think about what this phase entails is these monks need to enter into a sort of trance-like state, almost like an out-of-body experience, because what they're going to go through in this phase is so physically uncomfortable that unless you're able to kind of detach mentally, there's just no way to go through with it. And so during the second phase, the monks will sit down and meditate basically constantly for 100 straight days. And during that time, they don't eat any more tree byproducts or rocks. Instead, they have a liquid diet. They drink a little bit of salt water, and they drink a lot of a very particular kind of tea. The tea is made from Toxicodendron verniculum tree bark, which contains the same toxin in poison ivy. Meaning, for phase 2, you basically just sit alone by yourself for 100 days while simultaneously drinking a poisonous tea that causes a massive allergic reaction inside of your throat and stomach that causes an intense itching sensation inside of you that you cannot physically itch. Also, this poisonous tea gives you explosive diarrhea and it makes you vomit a lot. If you somehow manage to survive all 100 days of phase 2, and unfortunately many monks don't, you automatically move on to phase 3. Unlike phase 1, phase 2 never gets repeated, most likely because it almost certainly would be fatal to do so. Phase 3 is either the easiest or the hardest part of the Sokushin Bitsu ritual, depending on how you look at it. It doesn't have a name like the other 2 phases, perhaps because so few people make it to this part of the ritual, but regardless, phase 3 definitely has a strict set of rules like the other 2 phases. The phase 3 monk has a small pine box that has no windows built just for them. It needs to be big enough that they can sit inside of it in the lotus pose, which is how they typically sit when they're meditating. And then once it's all built, the monk climbs into this box. They put a lid over the top of it, but they put a bamboo shoot, like a bamboo pole, through the cover of this box. So there is a breathing tube for this monk inside of this box. And then they lower the monk inside of the small pine box 10 feet into this hole in the ground. And then once they ensure the bamboo pole is going to be above ground so they can breathe, they fill the hole in with charcoal. Before we cover what happens next in Phase 3, you need some context about what this ritual is actually doing to the monks performing it. Phase 1, tree eating training, serves two purposes. The first is it's kind of like a big gut check. It really shows who wants to do this ritual and who doesn't. It's kind of like if you can't complete Phase 1, you certainly can't complete Phase 2 or Phase 3. So it's like a filter. It weeds out the weak monks. The second purpose of Phase 1 is to literally shrink the monk. The tree-eating diet, combined with the constant physical exercise, removes all of their body fat and a lot of their muscle, and so they're incredibly lean by the end of Phase 1. And this will be significant when we talk about the end of Phase 3. Phase 2, deep meditation phase, serves two purposes as well. The first purpose is that it puts the monk into that trance-like state, and then the second purpose it serves is the toxin inside of this poisonous tea kills off all of the naturally occurring bacteria and parasites inside of the monk. Again, that will become significant when we get to the end of Phase 3. Speaking of which, so in Phase 3, the monk is put in their box, they're lowered 10 feet into the ground, the breathing bamboo shoot is installed, the charcoal is dumped on top of them, and then for several days, the third phase monk will sit in total darkness and meditate constantly, and each day, they have a bell down there with them. They ring the bell. That's the only thing they have to do besides meditate. And above ground, there is a team of monks that are supporting this ritual, and they're listening for that bell. And the first day they don't hear the bell, it means the monk in the box has completed the ritual, and now it is time to see if they have attained nirvana. In Buddhism, someone whose body does not decay, aka a mummy, is someone who has cheated death. And to cheat death is to remove yourself from the vicious human life cycle of birth, suffering, death, repeat. Meaning, becoming a mummy is a way to attain nirvana. And Sokushin Butsu is a self-mummification ritual. Phase 1 shrinks the monk's body. It removes their fat and muscle. It also removes a lot of moisture inside of their body. And their diet also withholds nutrients to all of the bacteria and parasites that naturally occur inside of their bodies. And so those bacteria and parasites that normally would play a big role in helping decompose your body after death begin to die off. And so the cumulative effect of Phase 1 on these monks is that if they were to die at the end of Phase 1, their decomposition would be drastically slowed. It wouldn't be mummy status, but it would be close. The Phase 2 poisonous tea, that toxin that they're drinking, that kills off the remainder of the bacteria and parasites that did not die during Phase 1. Also, all the vomiting and diarrhea completely dehydrates them, which aids in slowing down decomposition after death. Finally, Phase 3 is the death phase. The monk goes into their tomb, they're buried underground, and they ring that bell each day to tell the people on the ground that they are still alive. And then when the bell stops ringing, it means the monk in the box is dead. At which point, the crew on the ground removes the bamboo breathing pole and then lets the body sit in the box underground for another 1,000 days. And then after 1,000 days, they pull the box up, they lift the lid off, and if there is little to no signs of decay on their body, it means the self-mummification ritual worked, they're a mummy, they've attained nirvana, and now their body is holy. And so they're brought out of the box, they're dressed in robes, they're placed in the monasteries, and they are worshipped. As for the unlucky monks who get to the end of Sokushinbutsu, but are found to be decomposing inside of their box when they're brought back up again, they're just placed back inside of their pine box and buried, and they are not worshipped. Sokushinbutsu was made illegal in Japan in the late 19th century, but we know monks continued to practice it into the 20th century, and in theory, today, monks still might practice it in secret. It was a chilly morning on September 15th, 2007. A sheep farmer named Gregorio Yaruri sat on his porch, sipping a mug of coffee and looking at the distant mountain peaks that surrounded his hometown of Carancas, a small village in southern Peru. It was silent except for the sheep bleating in the pasture. Then Gregorio heard a low sound, like a hum. At first, the noise was faint, and it sounded like it was coming from miles away. Then the hum grew louder, and the coffee in his mug started to vibrate. A moment later, pebbles on the ground surrounding his porch began to shake as the hum turned into a roar. Alarmed, Gregorio set down his mug and leaped down into the yard. He looked around, trying to figure out if the noise was human-made, or maybe an earthquake. He covered his ears as the hum roared to a deafening scream. Then he spotted something small and orange streaking through the sky. An instant later, a sonic boom whipped across the valley, shattering a window in Gregorio's house. He was thrown onto his back and he rolled a few times before steadying himself in the dirt. Noises began to erupt all across the plain. Gregorio could hear dogs howling and shouts coming from some of the neighboring farms. Gregorio was bracing himself for something else to happen, but the sky above him was bright blue again. So he stood up, feeling totally shell-shocked, as he brushed the dust from his pants. He scanned the horizon for some clue as to what had caused this explosion. In the distance, he could see a plume of thick black smoke rising 100 feet into the air. At first, Gregorio was filled with dread. Then, a sense of determination swelled up inside of him. He needed to know what had just fallen from the sky. He ran for the bicycle he kept leaning up against the side of his house. He brushed the glass shards from his broken window off the seat, and then he hopped on and he set his feet on the pedals and took off towards the tower of smoke. As Gregorio neared the site of impact, the smell of rotten eggs stung the inside of his nostrils. He pulled over just long enough to grab his bandana out of his back pocket and tie it around his face to block the smell. About 100 feet from the tower of smoke, he noticed red dust covering the ground. The closer he got, the thicker the blanket of dust seemed to be. When he finally reached the base of the smoke plume, he rubbed the dust with his feet. It appeared to be clay that had been kicked up by the crash. The smoke was so thick, he still couldn't tell what had impacted the ground. But whatever it was, it had created what appeared to be a huge crater in the ground. The column of smoke was emerging from a hole about 50 feet across. It really looked like someone had just detonated a bomb there. A few minutes later, the smoke started thinning out, and Gregorio could finally see into this crater. He walked up to the edge, and his eyes widened from a combination of fear and wonder. The crater was filled with a dark green liquid. The liquid had a consistency somewhere between maybe water and sludge, and it was bubbling as if it was simmering. Gregorio pinched his nose through the bandana. The egg smell coming off of this crater was so strong that he felt sick to his stomach. He walked around the perimeter of the crater, kicking at the shards of clay and jagged rock that littered the ground. It looked like someone had smashed a huge vase to pieces. Gregorio scanned the horizon. It seemed like he was the only person who'd come to investigate this plume of smoke. He figured the neighboring farmers must be worried that whatever crashed into the ground was a bad omen. A lot of his neighbors still believed in ancient spirits. But after a while, it struck Gregorio as kind of odd that not even an emergency vehicle had come out to survey the scene. Something had just shot out of the sky and smashed into the earth. It felt like that was the kind of thing police would want to know about. But Gregorio knew help would not be coming from his village. Only about 250 people lived in Caracas, so it didn't have its own police force. The authorities were located in the nearby town of Desaguadero, which was about 7 miles up the road. Gregorio wasn't sure if the folks in Desaguadero would be able to see the smoke plume from there. If they couldn't, he worried that the authorities might not even know this happened. Gregorio jumped back on his bicycle and pedaled to the house of a neighbor who owned a motorcycle that Gregorio knew he'd be able to borrow. It was going to be up to him to raise the alarm, and he had to get out there fast. About 20 minutes later, Gregorio parked his borrowed motorcycle in front of the police station in Desaguadero and then walked inside. He was greeted by a tired-looking receptionist with the phone pressed to her ear. It seemed like she'd been talking to people for hours. 3 deputies were talking loudly about an airstrike. It took a minute for Gregorio to realize what was going on. The police did know about this explosion. One of them had seen the orange streak in the sky, but they thought that Caracas had actually been struck by a missile. Gregorio waved down one of the officers and explained he had seen a crater filled with this green ooze that smelled terrible. The officer disappeared into a back room for a moment, and then he returned with the chief of police. They asked if Gregorio could lead them to the crash site. Gregorio agreed. Soon, he was back on his neighbor's motorcycle, leading police cars along the 7-mile road back to the Caracas countryside. As the crash site came into view, Gregorio could see people moving around the rim of the crater. As he drew even closer, he realized that dozens of villagers from Caracas had come to see what had caused the smoke. He guessed that when the black plume of smoke had dissipated, the neighbors figured it was now safe to come take a look. Gregorio pulled over his motorcycle about 20 yards from the crater and dismounted. The police cars fanned out around him. As policemen approached the perimeter of the crater, Gregorio noticed his neighbors picking up rock fragments as souvenirs and pointing at the green liquid at the bottom of the massive hole. Gregorio overheard a nearby couple speculate that maybe this was the result of a missile strike from Peru's neighbor and rival, Chile. One teenage boy was talking excitedly, telling his friends they were probably just attacked by a UFO. An old woman, who Gregorio assumed was the boy's grandmother, told him to be quiet. This was clearly a sign of bad things to come, a curse sent by the spirits. She sounded terrified. Gregorio did not find any of these theories very convincing. However, he wasn't ready to offer any of his own. But the strange explosion had him just as curious as his neighbors. He picked up a shard of deep red rock near his feet and slipped it into his coat pocket, just as another car pulled onto the scene. Gregorio recognized the mayor of Caracas, Maximiliano Trujillo. Mayor Trujillo stepped out of the back seat, squinting in the sunlight. The mayor walked toward the crater, looking stunned. He stopped right next to Gregorio and asked what happened. Gregorio just shrugged, still in disbelief. Straight ahead of them, a pile of black rocks were smoking at the edge of the crater. The mayor's eyes widened when he saw them, and he began walking toward the crater to get a better look. By late afternoon, hundreds of people had gathered at the crash site. Gregorio stood near the front of the crowd, hoping that if he stuck around long enough, the police might announce what had caused this explosion. As the sun started to set, the smell of rotten eggs returned. It was faint, but pungent. Gregorio's eyes began to water. He pulled his bandana back up over his face, but that didn't work anymore. The smell was giving him a headache. A few minutes later, a short woman standing near Gregorio leaned over and began vomiting, and she wasn't the only one. People all around the crater were starting to get sick. Between the rotten smell coming off the green sludge and now the vomit, the air around the crater was now so thick that Gregorio thought he might faint. He fought his way through the crowd back to his motorcycle and sped off towards home, sucking in the fresh air as he went. When he walked through his front door, his phone was ringing. It was his son, who had moved about 6 hours away for a job after he had graduated school. As Gregorio told him about the afternoon's excitement, he took the rock out of his pocket and he laid it on the kitchen table. He began to describe its deep red color, but his son cut him off. He begged Gregorio not to touch it. If Caracas was attacked by a missile, then this red rock could very likely be radioactive.
Gregorio remembered the people getting sick at the crater. He felt a surge of anxiety, and he covered the rock with a dish towel. If his son was right, half the town was now vulnerable, and Gregorio spent more time at the crater than anyone else. Panicked, he hung up on his son and ran outside to hose himself off. He didn't know how much it would help, but he had to do something. He spent the rest of the evening feeling totally anxious, until finally he managed to fall asleep. The next morning, Gregorio woke up with the sun as usual. He still felt a bit queasy, but no worse than the night before. He breathed a big sigh of relief, because he figured that radiation poisoning would have made him feel a lot sicker by now, and so probably he was in the clear. As the sunrise turned the sky a vivid pink, Gregorio walked out of his house towards the sheep pen. He grabbed tufts of hay and dried grass and scattered them on the ground, and the sheep came running over to graze. Gregorio watched until one of the sheep picked its head up and ambled away. Then he noticed something unusual. There were dark splotches on the hay right where the sheep's head had been. It took Gregorio a moment to realize what he was looking at. He walked over and grabbed the sheep that had ambled off, and he lifted its head up, and blood was trickling out of its nose. Then he looked at the ground. Another splotch of blood stained the hay beneath his feet. As he walked the length of the pen, he found drops of blood spattered all over the ground. Gregorio rushed inside and called his vet, expecting to leave a voicemail since it was still early, but to his surprise, the vet actually picked up. He sounded wide awake, like he'd already been up for hours. He said that he'd been getting calls all morning. Livestock across Caracas were getting sick. The vet promised to make Gregorio's farm his next stop. Gregorio thanked him and hung up. He had no idea what kind of sickness had emerged from that crater, but it seemed like it could be deadly. A few days after the crash, Mayor Trujillo walked between rooms at a health clinic. Every exam table had been turned into a makeshift hospital bed. More than 200 people who visited the crash site had flooded the hospital in Desaguadero. They were all sick with migraine headaches, and they were vomiting. The hospital got so overwhelmed with patients, they diverted people to smaller health clinics throughout the city, which were now acting as satellite operations. Mayor Trujillo had called the Red Cross to help administer care in these satellite clinics, but now even the clinics were completely full. The smell inside the packed clinic was terrible. People were retching and crying. To the mayor, it felt like he was walking through a war zone. Thankfully, he'd received confirmation that morning from the authorities in Lima, the capital of Peru, that Caracas had not been attacked by a missile. In fact, scientists said that the crater had been caused by a meteorite. Mayor Trujillo was relieved that they were not under attack, but a mystery remained. Nobody knew why people were now getting sick. Meteorites had never been known to have that kind of effect. Specialists were flying out from Lima to investigate further. Mayor Trujillo moved through the crowd of patients in the waiting room, trying his best to reassure them. He stopped by a Red Cross doctor who was tending to a small elderly woman on a folding chair. The mayor greeted the old woman and then thanked the doctor for traveling all this way to Desaguadero. The doctor stood upright, looking tired but hopeful. He explained that all the patients' blood work was coming back normal. He didn't know why they were sick, but judging from their symptoms, he said everyone should make a full recovery in a few days. Trujillo smiled with relief, but the old woman hissed and called the doctor a liar. Many of the patients around her nodded in agreement, eyeing the doctor like he was in on some big conspiracy. He heard them muttering about evil spirits causing this disaster. Trujillo knew that many villagers believed the meteorite was a curse from the ancient spirits, and because of that, many had refused to listen to the Red Cross doctors and aid workers. To Trujillo, this was the problem with people of the Caracas region. Outsiders never came to the area, so many of the villagers didn't trust them. Trujillo knew that Caracas was not cursed. He just needed to find a way to get his people to listen. Then an idea struck. Maybe he could get them to believe the science with the help of someone who could appease the spirits. Trujillo left the health clinic, climbed into his car, and drove the 7 miles to Caracas. The small village, nestled in the shadows of snow-capped mountains, was eerily quiet and deserted. As the mayor slowly drove through the narrow and winding streets, he could see people peering out their windows. Normally, they'd come outside to wave hello, but now it seemed like they were terrified of leaving their homes. A few minutes later, Trujillo pulled up to a small adobe house with a thatched roof. It belonged to the local shaman, a man the mayor had long respected for his wisdom. Everybody in town trusted the shaman, and Trujillo hoped he could bring some calm to the community. Trujillo stepped out of his car, and he was pleased to see that the shaman came out of his house to greet him. Trujillo explained the situation to the shaman, and the shaman nodded thoughtfully, and he agreed that the meteorite was not a curse, although it had disrupted balance in the land. And so he said he was happy to do his part to restore the natural order of things. Trujillo smiled and shook the shaman's hand. He promised he'd be in touch soon, and then Mayor Trujillo headed back to his car. With the shaman's help, he was sure he could get the townspeople to listen to him and restore order in the town. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Montreal, Canada, a professor named Peter Schultz was standing in line at a coffee shop scrolling through the news app on his phone. He taught Earth, Environmental, and Planetary Sciences at Brown University in Rhode Island, but he was in Montreal for a conference on craters made by meteorites and other space objects. He was fascinated by the articles about the meteorite strike in southern Peru, and not just because he found meteorites in general interesting. This one stuck out because it made no sense. The reports said that Caracas was struck by a chondrite meteorite, the most common type of meteorite, but also the most fragile. A chondrite meteorite is a type of rock that comes from asteroids. They're made up of small grains of minerals that have not been melted or changed much since they formed billions of years ago. Chondrites are so porous that they crack and burn up in Earth's atmosphere before they can hit the ground. To Peter, it seemed impossible that one of these chondrite meteorites could hit the Earth with enough force to create this massive crater. Stranger still, he had read that more than 200 people who visited the crash site had ended up in the hospital. Meteorites should not be making people sick. Peter thought there had to be more to the story than met the eye. Peter turned his phone to silent and spent the rest of the afternoon in back-to-back lectures at his conference. He finally left around dusk. As he walked to dinner, he noticed his voicemail was full of inquiries from different reporters and news outlets, hoping for a comment from him on how a meteorite could cause such a widespread sickness. But Peter had to tell these reporters the truth. He did not have answers, but he wanted to get them, and the only way to do it was to head to Peru and see the crater for himself. A few days later, Mayor Trujillo stood in the very crowded community center in Desaguadero. He had needed a huge space to hold this town hall meeting, and Caracas didn't really have a building that could accommodate this size crowd. Even this community center was packed with almost every single person from Caracas in attendance. The mayor shivered, but not because he was cold. He knew that the government scientists had discovered something that would have a profound impact on everyone in this area, and not just for those who had gotten sick at the crater. As Trujillo stood there waiting, he spotted Gregorio Ururi sitting in the back. He was grateful to him for his role in alerting the authorities, and was happy to see that Gregorio looked healthy. In fact, most of the locals who'd gotten sick were starting to feel better. But Trujillo knew if they didn't listen to the scientists, then things could get worse again. Trujillo had invited 2 guests to this meeting. One was the local shaman, and the other was a geologist named Luisa Macedo. She was one of the scientists flown in by the government. The mayor made his way to the front of the crowd and called for silence. He had to choose his words carefully to avoid panicking those who believed that Caracas was actually cursed. He cleared his throat and announced that, yes, something had fallen from the sky, but it had been a meteorite from outer space. Before anyone could argue with him, he called the shaman over to join him and asked if he could prepare a sacrifice. It needed to be something that would appease the spirits in case they were the ones who sent the meteorite crashing to Earth. The shaman nodded. He told the crowd that they had rightfully sensed that the meteorite had unbalanced the land, but he reassured them that the correct sacrifice would help appease any unhappy spirits. He promised he would sacrifice a llama fetus at the crater as soon as possible, which should be enough to restore harmony to the area. Several of the older women present smiled, but Mayor Trujillo was still tense. Now came the hard part, getting them to accept the scientists' findings without panicking. He introduced Luisa, the government geologist. The hall erupted in whispers. Trujillo told the villagers to calm down, that Luisa was from southern Peru just like they were. That's why he'd asked her to speak. Everyone seemed to accept this, since a regional scientist seemed a little more trustworthy. The crowd settled down a bit, and then Luisa smiled and she held up a large cardboard chart she'd made showing data on the local water table. Trujillo held his breath, worried she was making things more complicated. Instead, the crowd pushed in to get a better look at what she had. Luisa explained that she and her team weren't totally sure what was making so many people and livestock sick, but they had a strong theory. The day that she and her team had arrived in town, they'd gone to the crash site and collected samples from different parts of the area. They also tested the groundwater at the bottom of the crater. Mayor Trujillo saw Luisa hesitate for a moment and then continue. She said that her team found that the water contained dangerous levels of arsenic, a deadly poison. The crowd erupted in murmurs of alarm. As Trujillo looked around the room, he wasn't surprised by everyone's reaction. When he first heard Luisa's theory, he'd been stunned too, but he needed the crowd to listen. Their lives depended on what Luisa had to say. Trujillo raised his hands and called for order, and after a few seconds, the townspeople did quiet down, and he told them to continue to listen to Luisa. Luisa nodded and then explained that when the meteorite hit Caracas, the shockwave caused the groundwater to heat up and vaporize. This caused the air to fill with a fine mist of arsenic vapor. Everyone who had gone to see the crater got sick because they had inhaled that vapor. After hearing what she had to say, the crowd became agitated again and started shouting questions. Mayor Trujillo saw Gregorio in the back, trying to be heard, and so Trujillo demanded everyone be quiet, and he pointed at Gregorio and asked him to speak. Gregorio, the sheep farmer, stood up and politely asked Luisa if that meant their drinking water was contaminated too. Luisa stayed silent for a moment. Trujillo could tell she was carefully thinking about what to say next. Finally, she nodded and said that although they did need to do more testing, it was very likely. In fact, most likely, their water supply had been contaminated for years, making the people less healthy and more vulnerable to deadly diseases like cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. And so until they knew for sure, Luisa advised the crowd to just drink bottled water. Gregorio was alarmed by what he heard, but he thanked her and sat down. Everyone else seemed totally stunned into silence by Luisa's explanation. First the meteor hit, making people sick. Now they learned their water was contaminated all along. Trujillo knew it was frightening, but at least they knew what they were dealing with. After answering more questions, Luisa wrapped up her remarks and walked off the stage. But as she headed toward him, Mayor Trujillo noticed that the scientist looked anxious. He pulled her aside and asked if everything was okay. Luisa shook her head and told him that something still didn't make sense. She was confident that the sickness had been caused by arsenic gas from the meteorite impact, but she had not actually proven that. No scientists had detected arsenic in the air around the crater. That was a theory. In fact, she didn't understand how the meteorite could have gotten hot enough to create this toxic arsenic vapor. Luisa explained that meteorites are usually freezing when they impact Earth, even though they may look like they're on fire. That's because space is extremely cold, with an average temperature of negative 454 degrees Fahrenheit. The friction caused by entering Earth's atmosphere would have heated it up a little bit, but not enough to boil water and turn it into a mist. Mayor Trujillo frowned. He now realized that even Luisa wasn't sure that her arsenic theory was right. And if she was wrong, then something else had made his people sick. Trujillo was troubled. But he had a more immediate challenge, making sure the local drinking water was safe. It was up to the scientists to figure out whether arsenic vapor or something else had caused the mass sickness. Until they figured it out, Trujillo knew he would not sleep well. A little over 2 months later, in December of 2007, Professor Peter Schultz arrived in Caracas to investigate the crash site. On a dry and sunny day, he drove through the winding roads of the rugged countryside until he reached the crater. Even though the rainy season had nearly filled it with water, he was struck by how massive it was. Peter had heard about Luisa Macedo's discovery of arsenic in the water. There was no debate that there was arsenic in the water itself, but so far, nobody had been able to explain how, or even if, arsenic got into the air. Until that was proven, there was still the possibility that some other chemical from the meteorite's impact had made everyone sick. If that was the case, the people of Caracas could still be in danger. Peter was determined to find the answer and make sure these people were safe. And over the next few weeks, he was able to slowly form a theory that connected all the dots. Usually, when chondrite meteorites shoot through the Earth's atmosphere, their fragile makeup causes them to shatter into hundreds of tiny pieces, which turn to ash long before they ever reach the Earth's surface. And that's what should have happened with this meteorite. Peter concluded that the Caracas meteorite survived its passage through the atmosphere because of its high speed and shallow entry angle. He believed that these factors, along with the heat from the Earth's atmosphere, caused the outer layers of the meteorite to melt and fuse back together. That made it dense enough to make it through the atmosphere, where it became superheated and unleashed the arsenic vapor once it hit the ground. All this meant that the people of Caracas were safe. It was the meteorite and not some other unidentified danger that heated up the arsenic-laced water and turned it into vapor. Thankfully, the damage caused by the meteorite's impact was not permanent. All the people who'd gotten sick, including Gregorio Yaruri, made a full recovery, and so did all the animals. Thanks to the research of Luisa Macedo and the other scientists, arsenic was detected in the drinking water, and nonprofit organizations have installed measures to make it safer. Even though the water is cleaner and the arsenic gas is long gone, the people of Caracas will always remember when, in a way, they were attacked by a UFO.
On the afternoon of July 9th, 2001, a 13-year-old boy named Cody Clausen carried a bag of camping supplies through the woods near Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. Cody had come to the woods for a camping trip with his dad and his Boy Scout troop. But about 30 minutes earlier, he had broken off from the main group, they were over at camp, and he had hiked a couple of miles to his dad's truck to pick up some extra camping supplies. And now that he had those supplies, he had turned around and begun hiking back towards the rest of the group. As Cody hiked along, he kind of let his mind wander. He was thinking about what story he was going to tell that night around the campfire to impress the other Boy Scouts. But as he was thinking about it and kind of walking along, he started to realize that things didn't look familiar. And at some point, he started to wonder, why haven't I actually reached the campsite yet? And at that point, he stopped, he didn't panic, and he just kind of looked around and realized that he actually had left the path. He was not even in an area that he had seen before. And so being a Boy Scout, he kind of stayed calm and he just turned around and decided he would retrace his steps back to his dad's truck and start again. He would obviously be very late back to camp, but at least he'd come back in one piece. But as he retraced his steps, he really didn't know where he had come from, because again, he had sort of left the trail because his mind was wandering. And so before long, Cody realized he was totally lost, and he started to panic. Hours passed by as Cody frantically walked around the woods, calling out for help, but not hearing anybody calling back to him. And then as the sun began to set, he also noticed that storm clouds were rolling in. And so this situation was becoming dire very quickly. But he told himself, don't worry, my father and the Boy Scout troop, they clearly know by this point that I'm missing and they must be out looking for me. But Cody knew there was no telling how long it would take for them to find him. I mean, it could be hours, or it could be days. Or, the thought was totally terrifying, but they might not find him at all. But at this point, Cody was able to calm himself down and tell himself, hey, you're a Boy Scout. You can do this. You can at least stay out here, make a shelter, build a fire, and kind of just wait while someone comes to find you. That's all you can do at this point.
And so he had his bag of supplies with him, and so he took it off and he dumped the contents out, and quickly he realized the contents of this bag were not going to help him. Certainly not going to help him build a fire or shelter. But worse than that was there also wasn't any food, and he barely had any water. So effectively, he had nothing. And then, of course, to make matters even worse, the sky suddenly let loose, and Cody was caught in a major thunderstorm. And so Cody rounded up whatever he could, threw it in his bag, and just started running in the dark through the trees as hail is pelting him, and it's thunder and lightning, and he's got no idea what he's gonna do. And then suddenly lightning flashes across the sky, and for a second the forest is illuminated, and right up ahead of him is this cave. And so Cody runs into the cave and he takes shelter inside of it. It's pouring rain outside, it's so loud, it's so chaotic, and he's terrified. But now it's like his body just shuts down. He's so overwhelmed, he's so scared as he's laying there like wondering, am I gonna die out here? That he just closes his eyes and passes out just from sheer exhaustion. The next morning, Cody woke up still sheltering inside of this cave. And the first thing he noticed is when he looked out into the woods was the storm had stopped, the rain had let up. And then the second thing he noticed was he heard the distinct sound of a helicopter flying somewhere nearby. Cody instantly ran out of the cave and looked up into the sky, and sure enough, there was this small helicopter flying around roughly in his area. And so using some of his Boy Scout training, he pulled off his belt and he used the metal buckle of his belt to reflect the sunlight back up at the pilot to get the pilot's attention. And it worked. He got the pilot clearly to notice him, and before long, he noticed the pilot hovering down lower and lower right over the tree line, looking for a place to land. And so Cody is so overjoyed, he's about to be saved. He grabs his stuff and just charges over roughly to the area where the pilot's trying to land, and by the time he gets in that vicinity, he sees the pilot actually touching down in a clearing. Cody can't believe it. It's only been one day and he's been found. And so Cody runs over to the helicopter, throws the door open, gets inside, and the pilot just turns around and says, "Good morning." And Cody, at first, doesn't really register what's happening here. He's only just completely relieved that he is going to survive. But then he kind of stops and looks at the pilot, and he can't believe who it is that's just rescued him. It would turn out, the night before, when Cody did not return to the camp, his father and the Boy Scout troop did contact authorities, and before long, a local search party was organized. And one of those people who volunteered to be a part of the search was an amateur pilot who lived in the area. That helicopter pilot was the one who found Cody 10 miles away from his Boy Scout troop's camp. When that pilot reunited Cody with his father, Cody's father naturally assumed that, given the trauma of the last 24 hours, that Cody would not want to rejoin the Boy Scout troop and continue this camping trip, that he would want to go home. But instead, Cody said, no, I want to go back to the Boy Scout troop. I want to sit there and tell them what happened to me, because now I have a campfire story that they are not going to believe. Cody had trekked 10 miles through the wilderness all alone, spent the night with bears out in a cave somewhere in the middle of a storm, and then ultimately got rescued by this amateur helicopter pilot who happened to be, at the time, one of the most famous people in the world. The amateur pilot was the actor who had played Han Solo in Star Wars, he was Indiana Jones, and had starred in several other major blockbuster movies. It was none other than Harrison Ford. You know that feeling when you just get totally immersed and lost inside of a story from start to finish? Well, that's exactly what Audible brings right to you. Whether you're stuck in traffic or hitting the gym or winding down after a long day, Audible always has a story that will bring you right in. Thrillers, fantasies, true crime, you name it, it's all there on Audible, all just a click of a play button away. So go unleash your adventurous side with Audible's vast library of entertainment. Sink into gripping titles that'll keep you guessing all the way to the very end. Also, you can discover exclusive Audible originals that you can't find anywhere else, and be the first to experience exciting new releases from your favorite authors. And if you're looking for a recommendation, maybe check out Mrballen Presents The Graphic Stories. I hear that's a pretty good graphic novel, and they do have a really amazing audiobook. Check that one out. Discover stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Your next great adventure awaits with Audible. Start listening today when you sign up for a free 30-day trial at audible.com/Mrballen. Okay, back to the story. In September of 1954, a 14-year-old boy named Rich shuffled his way down the hallway of a children's hospital in England. He coughed and wheezed as he slowly walked down the hall next to other sick kids as they made their way towards the hospital's classroom. Now, Rich didn't know what kind of lesson he and the other kids were going to get today, but frankly, he didn't care. Anything was better than just sitting in his hospital room, bored out of his mind. So Rich was in the hospital because he was suffering from tuberculosis, which is an infectious lung disease. And over the past 10 weeks, he'd been bouncing around to different hospitals. And in fact, his condition was still so bad that this hospital had informed his parents that Rich might need to stay in the hospital for another 2 years. And as awful as this sounded to Rich, this actually was not the first time something like this had happened to him. When he was 6 years old, his appendix burst, and then he contracted an infection that left him in a coma for several weeks. And then when he came out of the coma, he had to recover in a hospital for nearly a year. And all this time in hospitals had really impacted Rich's life, in particular in terms of how far behind he had fallen in school. And because his family was not a well-off family, they couldn't afford to hire a tutor to kind of keep Rich up to speed. And so basically at this point, Rich's education consisted of, whatever random classes these hospitals he was staying in sporadically had. Whenever they hired a teacher to come in and teach basket weaving or, shop class, whatever was available, that was his education. So that day, when Rich walked into the hospital classroom, he did not have high expectations about what he would be taught that day. He figured it was just going to be some random class that he would sit through that at least was keeping him out of his hospital bedroom. But the instant he saw the teacher for the day and saw what was surrounding the teacher, he was really excited. Because all around the teacher were musical instruments. And Rich, as a kid, had always dreamed of playing the drum. He had seen one day in a Windows shop a drum set and he had wanted it so badly, but his family didn't have the money to pay for it, so he had never had a chance to do it. But now it seemed like Rich was finally going to get his chance. And so when the teacher began handing out the instruments to the kids, Rich demanded that he get the drum set. He would not play anything else. And the teacher was like, okay. And so he was given the drum. And then that day, the teacher led the class, through a couple of basic songs, and Rich played the drum, and he and everybody else were objectively terrible, like the music was awful. But by the end of the class, Rich was totally revitalized here. I mean, he hadn't discovered some special new talent for playing the drums, but he had discovered that he had this amazing passion for playing the drum. It was like all he wanted to do now. And he figured that because he was going to be stuck in the hospital for the foreseeable future, he would just spend all of his time on practicing playing the drum. So the following day, Rich went into a closet in the hospital and he found these long sticks that were normally used for knitting, and they became his drumsticks. And for the next year and a half, Rich basically banged these makeshift drumsticks on anything he could to practice. And then also every few weeks, when the music teacher came back to the hospital, Rich would go to those classes and he would try to learn as much as he possibly could from the teacher. And that was basically his whole life, was those classes and banging on everything he could. Finally, in 1955, when Rich was 16 years old, he was released from the hospital. He was finally cured from tuberculosis. However, despite having his health back, it isn't like his life suddenly got a whole lot easier. It isn't like, he left the hospital and, magically became this amazing drummer and that was his life. Instead, his family was really struggling financially, and so Rich couldn't go back to school. He basically had to get a job in a factory and work full-time just to help support his family. And for Rich, he felt like that was the right thing to do. He didn't resent his family. This is what his life was. And what he did is he found joy, while he was working in grabbing makeshift drumsticks and just banging on stuff any chance he could. And he figured that that would be his life. He would just work and, find joy in drumming whenever he could. But Rich's outlook on life changed dramatically on Christmas of 1956, so a year after he'd left the hospital. Because on that Christmas, Rich's stepfather had secretly saved up all this extra money by working all these extra shifts and doing whatever he could to finally buy Rich his own drum set. To this point, Rich had not been able to have his own drum set. Everything was makeshift. And so that Christmas, he gets this drum kit, and Rich is like, this is the best gift I've ever been given. And he began practicing even more. And pretty quickly, he began playing with local bands every time he had time off. And before long, he became known as like a guy in town who was like one of the best drummers. And then shortly after that, right as Rich is kind of hitting his stride, being this kind of local celebrity, this local, very popular band fired their drummer. And so it made perfect sense that they approached Rich and said, hey,
"Will you join our band?" And Rich said, "Let's do it." By this point, Rich had become known by his stage name, Ringo Starr, and that band that recruited him was the Beatles. Around 11 a.m. on Sunday, October 20th, 1991, a 31-year-old man named Will woke up next to his wife in their home in Oakland, California. And the first thing Will noticed as soon as he was awake was the smell of smoke. Will got out of his bed and went to the window, and when he looked out, he could see there was this big plume of smoke coming from what looked like right outside of his neighborhood. And since he lived in California, where wildfires were unfortunately a common reality, he thought that's got to be a wildfire. So Will called 911 to report it, but the dispatcher told him that yes, that is a wildfire. It's on a mountainside, about 600 feet away from Will's house in his neighborhood. But they said the fire department was already all over it, and the smoke he was seeing was simply the leftover, after the fire had been put out. So no real threat here. And so after hearing this, Will's mind was put at ease. He thanked the dispatcher and hung up, and then he went about his normal morning routine. And as he brushed his teeth and took a shower, his mind began to wander towards work. So Will was a software developer, and he was in the middle of working on this video game about ants, like the insects, and how they go about building their homes. And Will was really excited about this game. But as Will left the bathroom and happened to look out the window that he looked out before and saw that plume of smoke out on the mountainside, any thoughts of his video game immediately vanished. Because now he was looking out and he saw this huge cloud of smoke that, in addition to being much bigger, there was also obvious flames licking up. Like, clearly the fire is not extinguished, and worse, it appeared the fire was moving in the direction of his neighborhood, and pretty quickly. And so Will immediately grabs the phone and he calls 911 again, and he reports that, "Hey, I'm seeing a fire here." And he could tell just from the dispatcher's voice that they were kind of surprised. They felt like the fire was under control. Like, what are you talking about? And so Will realized, based on this response, I can't afford to wait for help. I mean, it's unclear if they even know what's going on here, and this fire appears to be moving right towards me. And so after hanging up with the dispatcher, Will knew he had to act. And so Will runs to his wife, who by this point, she's looking out the window too. She's terrified. And they're like, "What are we going to do here?" And they decide, we just got to evacuate. By this point, the fire is literally coming right towards them. The smoke is beginning to overwhelm them. And so they just grabbed a couple of bare necessities. They charged out of their house and they're looking down the street. And again, the smoke by this point is kind of, making it hard to see, but they can see other neighbors are frantically getting in their cars to evacuate as well. And Will and his wife, they're about to speed off when they remember their neighbors had gone away for the weekend and they had left their old parents to look after their 2-year-old kid, and they didn't have a car. And so Will's like, oh my gosh, he runs next door, he pounds on the door, and the grandparents, they come out and they're scared as well. They have the 2-year-old, and Will's like, come on. They grabbed a couple of necessities, they hopped in Will's car, and before long, all of them were peeling down the road, evacuating. 1 week later, Will returned to his neighborhood. This time in the passenger seat of a police cruiser, because you needed an official escort to be able to go into this area because of how dangerous it was. There was debris everywhere. When the police officer stopped in front of Will's address and Will got out, he looked at where his house used to be, and it was just gone. Like every other house in his neighborhood, it was completely leveled by this fire. That fire burned for 4 days, destroyed thousands of homes, including basically Will's entire neighborhood, and it killed 25 people. Will walked towards the rubble that used to be his home, and as he stood there surveying the area, he was hit with this epiphany. He didn't really care that he had lost all of his things, like everything he owned basically had been destroyed by this fire, but he just didn't care. Instead, all he cared about and all he was grateful for was his family. Like, they had survived, they'd escaped the fire. That's what mattered. And so as he's standing there, sort of a little bit numb to what's happened here, he looked down and he saw ants. Now remember, he was developing this video game about ants, and so had done tons of research about ants. And he saw these ants that definitely were destroyed by this fire as much as the people were. I mean, their colonies were all burnt up and destroyed as well. But he saw these ants, and what they were doing was gathering supplies and rebuilding, brick by brick. That's what they were doing. That's what ants do. They simply go forward and rebuild, no matter the tragedy. And this gave Will an idea. 9 years later, Will finally released his video game. But it was not the game he had been developing, the one about ants. Instead, it was inspired by the ants he saw marching through the rubble after this horrible fire. In this game he made, you could create characters like avatars who could live entire digital lives, complete with homes and neighbors and spouses and kids and friends, like it really was an actual universe in this game. But this game is not set in a perfect fantasy world. Instead, the universe that these characters live inside of is meant to mimic the real world that we live in, where tragedies can strike, and often do, sort of unpredictably. Death, destruction, wildfires, you name it, that's just kind of part of living in this world. And so in this game, characters periodically would just have horrible things happen to them, and they would have to rebuild, just like the ants had to rebuild, and just like Will and his family and everybody else affected by that fire. You just have to move forward and rebuild. Will's game wound up being a massive success, selling tens of millions of copies worldwide, and today hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people still play it. Will's full name was Will Wright, and the game he created was The Sims. In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, Mrballen Presents Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved, from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you got to check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at book.ballenstudios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited number of hand-signed copies available, but those are going to sell out very quickly. So please pre-order today, because remember, your nightmares are waiting. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know